Hello everyone, this is the next part in the GMing Daggerheart series. In this video, we'll be talking about how to prep a one-shot, a campaign, and how to create cool locations, NPCs, and encounters, while also taking a look at adversary and environmental stat blocks. Let's jump into it. First up, one-shots. If you're running a one-shot for your first game, there is a nice fill-in-the-blank template that you can use on page 184. You can use this template to prepare a story ahead of time, or you can work with your players to create the story as you play, Mad Lib style, and really lean into that collaborative storytelling side of the game. If you're writing a one-shot and you want to make sure that it is done in one night, keep the story simple. You should only really have one storyline with no red herrings and maybe one or two combat encounters, including the final boss. Don't worry about the story being too simple because all of the gaps in the story will be filled with the player's imaginations anyways, so they'll still have a bunch of fun. All right. That's all I'm going to say about one-shots for now. Some of the stuff that I'll say about campaign prepping can also be applied to one-shots, so I'll just talk about those points there. So if you are running a campaign, prepping your sessions is going to be a lot of work at the start, and then a continuous thing that takes weekly work as the campaign goes on, depending on how often you play. You should have a general idea of which direction the campaign is going, but you should never have a strict, concrete plan figured out because I guarantee the players are going to do something that you weren't expecting, and all of those details that you took so much time to write will be just out the window. So write up an outline and make sure to incorporate answers from the PC's backstories and connection questions into the campaign as much as possible. Remember those notes I was talking about in the previous video for session 0? Here is where you are going to use them. Having them in front of you when you write and prep every week keeps their stories in the forefront of your mind. And when you add their stories to the campaign, it gives the players stake in that story, which usually makes them want to keep playing. With all of that in mind, begin writing up that outline using story arcs. Story arcs are used to focus on specific objectives, themes, characters, or ideas. These arcs can be as short or as long as you need them to be. I'm using story arcs in the form of acts for Bitten to separate themes that I want to focus on each of the 3 acts I have for this campaign. The book also uses the 3-act structure where Act 1 is the introduction, Act 2 is the trials and tribulations, and Act 3 is the finale, which can mean anything from the end of a quest to the end of the campaign. To keep things nice and tidy, there is a nice long-term arcs table that you can find on page 191. This table helps you separate the different plots that you have over the span of the 3 acts. It also shows each of the sessions and which plot line the A, B, or C plot of the story is focused on at that time. When something is the A plot, this is the main plot that the PCs are focusing on. B plot is the secondary plot that will then eventually become the A plot of the story. You can show the B plot through hints or through the party taking care of a small thing for that B plot. And then that way, when the current A plot ends, the foreshadowing gets the party ready for the B plot to then become the new A plot. C plots are the back burner plots that are usually only referenced offhandedly by NPCs talking about some distant thing that may have happened far away, something that you really only need to reference and don't really have to have the party interact with it until it becomes a B plot and then eventually the A plot. And at the time that it becomes the A plot, your players can then look back and see all of the little breadcrumbs that you'd been laying all along. And you can also add a D plot or an E plot if the campaign is longer spanning, but that's the basics for using this chart. When finishing your outline, you'll begin prepping your sessions. Typically when I prep, I think in terms of scenes. Think of scenes just like any movie. These are moments where we spotlight the PCs in something that they're doing, whether that's resting, exploring a mysterious site, or when they're speaking with the potion seller to sell them their strongest potions. The length of the scenes mainly depends on how much your players like RPing as their characters. So this will be something that you'll have to fine-tune for your group, especially if you all play for longer than 3 to 4 hours at a time. For Bitten, we usually play 2.5 to 3.5 hours, and we get through about 6 to 7 scenes per game. When I make scenes, I like to organize them using bullet points. I typically like to write down a long version of what I'm thinking, and then I'll write down a TLDR list for myself while I'm running it so I can quickly look at the notes and then remember what I had written down as I run those scenes. I also use Roll20, which means that I can link all the handouts I create and make a web of connecting scenes and encounters by just clicking those links. If you're interested in doing that, all you have to do is put these brackets on either side of a title for another handout, and once you save the current handout, that text should turn pink and become a link that you can then click and the other handout will pop up. I'm also a fancy bitch and I like headers and bolding and italics and using the same formatting as the book, but feel free to do with that or not, whatever works best for you and your note taking. Another thing I like to do is limit my prep to things of 3: quest lines, locations, NPCs. This is usually the sweet spot for the amount of things your players will actually get to see in the story before something else happens or before the story becomes too stale. The rule of 3 also helps you avoid overprepping and underprepping. Underprepping is when you don't put enough detail in the plotline before the session, so most of the story is made up on the spot. This can lead to mediocre stories and worse, railroading. I'll be talking about railroading in my next video, but for now, it's basically forcing your players to do one thing in the story that they don't want to do, which never ends well. Underprepping for something like a mystery can also lead to having only one clue that the PCs are supposed to find or one place that they're supposed to go to for the next part of the story. This creates a narrative bottleneck and almost always results in the players not finding that clue or not going to the place, which then puts the whole story on halt. But on the other hand, overprepping is when you put way too much detail into the story, where it starts to bog down the storytelling process, leading to the players' disinterest because nothing is more boring than 3 minutes of information about what an NPC looks like. Look, I'm an ex-overpreparer. I know that it's a way to combat the feeling of underpreparedness, which in itself is an anxiety reaction. Just remember what the stakes are. Again, this is a game that you are playing with your friends to tell a neat story together. You are going to make mistakes despite the amount of prep that you do, so just lean into those mistakes. Focus on having fun with your friends more than you want to impress them by the amount of work that you put into this world. In fact, you should intentionally leave blank spaces for your players to add their own ideas, because bringing them into the world building aspect is a great way to give them that emotional stake in the world. So follow the rule of 3 and be ready to bring the players in to fill in the blanks. All right, let's go back to prep. When making locations, you'll want to figure out what a location's narrative function is. You'll be hearing narrative function a lot. Is it a place for the PCs to rest? Is it a dungeon filled with dangerous monsters? Is it a city brimming with opportunities? And also, when writing your room descriptions, here are a few things to keep in mind. Keep the descriptions brief. Long descriptions will lose your player's interest, whether that's malicious or not. Use all of the senses, not just sight. What does the dusty room smell like? What do they hear? Then, after the senses, you'll describe the rough dimensions of the room and any doors or windows they might see, and then you will start with the important and distinct features, followed by any dangers that may be there. Also, when creating a location, make sure there's no empty rooms. That's a boring waste of time. Add a potion with a story, or just cut the room out entirely. The last thing I'll say is you don't need descriptions for every room. Try to sit in the uncomfortability of not having everything written down. Write some quick notes that you can fall back on, but practice your improv skill by going with the flow. You'd be surprised with how well you can do. Making NPCs is a very similar process to locations. I like to find inspiration from other media and then look for art on Pinterest and then give them a narrative function. I give important NPCs long-term goals, short-term goals, secrets, and I typically connect them to some sort of pop culture reference for voices and mannerisms. That being said, most of the NPCs that you'll be playing, like the random guard, the person off the street, the barkeep, each of these normal people can be just that, normal. You don't have to make stories for every character in your game, but if that's something that you'd like to do, then by all means go for it. But I do recommend having a list of names for these randos that the PCs speak to. And it is required to have at least one little guy named Fartbuckle or your choice of a silly name so that they can travel alongside the party. All right, now let's talk about how to fill in your locations with combat encounters. First, we need to understand the narrative function of the encounter. This can be anything from a resource drain while the players explore a dungeon to a training encounter with the local militia before a giant battle, or the multiversal boss fight at the end of the campaign. Forbidden Episode 3 was the first combat encounter we had. The narrative function of that encounter was 1, to show that yes, the world is dangerous even just outside your city walls, and 2, to show the consequences of one of the PC's actions from the previous episode and being faced with those consequences. Next, we want to figure out who these adversaries are and why they're fighting the party, or in other words, what their narrative function is. Check out page 210 to 239 for a whole bunch of different monsters that you can choose from. But if none of these adversaries fit what you need, or if you find yourself in a position where you need adversary stats in a pinch, check out page 208. They have a chart for each tier and what stats you should use for an improvised adversary. Speaking of stats, let's take a look at the typical stat block of an adversary. At the top, you'll see the adversary's name. Just beneath that, you'll see the tier, which gives you a general idea of the power level that that adversary is. And after the tier, you'll then see the type of adversary this is. There are 10 different types, each of them performing their own distinct function in a battle. Bruisers are tough enemies that have powerful attacks. Hordes are groups of identical creatures that attack together as a single unit. Leaders command and also summon other adversaries. Minions are easily killed adversaries but are dangerous in numbers if left alone. Ranged adversaries are weak in close encounters but can attack from far away for even higher damage. Skulks maneuver and exploit opportunities to ambush opponents. Socials present unique challenges to overcome through conversation rather than combat. Solos present a formidable challenge to an entire party with or without support. Standards are rank and file adversaries that represent the rest of the group, and supports enhance their allies and disrupt their opponents. And if you want to read about each of these types in more depth, check out pages 198 to 207. These talk about their mechanics, examples, and instructions for how to make a custom adversary of that type. If you're interested in me doing a more deep discussion about adversary types, let me know in the comments and I'll make a video later. And heck, while we're at it, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Next on the stat block, you will see a short description of who this adversary is. Then you'll see their motives and tactics. These are just to tell you a little bit about where you will find them and what their goals typically are. And then next, you'll find the mechanics of the adversaries. Difficulty is a catch-all number to beat. This is what the PCs need to roll to hit them, to beat their effects, what they need to hit for a reaction roll against them, etc. The threshold rules are the same as the PCs. Minor, major, severe. HP and stress are the same. Their attack bonus is what you add to your D20 rolls. Then you will see their regular attack. This will tell you the weapon or the type of attack, the range, the damage die, and the type of damage. Just below that, depending on the adversary, you might see an experience or two. These function exactly the same as the experiences for PCs, but you would just spend a fear to use them instead of a hope. You can also spend a hope to add them to the difficulty. Next, you'll see the features that the adversary has. There are a few couple types of features that we'll talk about. First being passive features. These happen regardless of whether the adversary is spotlighted or not. Then there is the action feature. These are things that you can do when you spotlight that adversary. Some even require you to mark a stress or spend a fear. And then there is reaction features, where these trigger in response to a specific thing happening. These also happen regardless of whether the adversary is spotlighted or not. There are also a few specific features that you'll see quite often. Fear features require you to spend an additional fear in order to use that feature. Summoning features allow you to add more adversaries to the battle. And when they say a range in which they appear, this refers to the range in relation to the one that summoned them. This is something to use when the battle may look a little too easy and need a couple more adversaries to even it out. Spotlighting features allow you to immediately spotlight other adversaries without having to spend any additional fear. When it spotlights multiple adversaries, you get to choose which order in which to spotlight them. And then more specific features you'll see are things like momentum, which is when the adversary makes a successful attack, you gain a fear. This is typically found on bruisers or solos to keep the fear economy going. Relentless always has a number next to it, which represents how many times you can spotlight this adversary each time that you take the spotlight. Even though that adversary has Relentless, you still will have to spend an additional fear in order to spotlight it again. Minion also has a number next to it. Minions die after any damage is taken, so this number represents every X amount of damage this minion takes. The PC can kill another minion with that same attack with the weapon's normal range. So if a player hits a minion for minion 6, deals 12 damage, they would kill that minion and then 2 others that are in that weapon's range. Minions also have group attack that allow you to spend a fear to spotlight all minions in a specific area for 1 attack. The Horde feature shows you how much damage their regular attack will do once the Horde adversary hits half of its HP. And then some of the adversaries also have countdowns in some of their features. Loop countdowns are ones that are more common. These will always have a static number that the countdown starts at. You start the encounter with having access to using that ability, and once you use it, you begin the countdown. Each time a player makes an action roll, the countdown ticks down by 1, and then once it's triggered, you can then use that ability again. Once you use it, we rinse and repeat and do the countdown all over again. A similar countdown will say countdown and a type of die. This countdown functions similarly to the loop countdown, but instead of starting at a specific number, once you use that ability, you will then roll that die and start at that number. Each PC roll also takes it down by 1, and once it's triggered, you then gain access to that ability again, and then once you use it again, you roll it again, and so on and so forth. Some monsters have unique countdowns like the Gorgon's Petrifying Gaze, but those will describe how the countdown works in the feature itself. When any of these features allow you to attack multiple targets in an area, you will roll once and apply that roll to everyone affected by that feature. And when a feature targets a group, you select a point in the battlefield and anyone within very close range of that point is in that group. All right, back to adversary types. These are helpful to understand how that type of adversary plays, but they also tell us how to balance combat encounters. To do this, we're going to be heading over to page 197 to check out the battle guide. In the battle guide, it talks about battle points, how many each adversary is worth, and how many you're supposed to have per encounter. The battle points budget formula is 3 times the number of PCs plus 2. So if you have 3 PCs, that would be 11, 4 would be 14, and 5 would be 17. This number will also be adjusted depending on the difficulty of the encounter you want, which adversaries you choose, or if you're making the adversaries hit harder. Here is a list of the battle points budget adjustments. You subtract 1 from the budget if the fight should be less difficult or shorter. Subtract 2 points if you are using 2 or more solo adversaries. Subtract 2 points if you are adding an additional 1d4 or a general +2 to all adversary damage rolls. This is meant to challenge the players without lengthening the battle. And then you'll add 1 point for each adversary chosen from a lower tier. You add 1 point if the encounter doesn't have any bruisers, hordes, leaders, or solos. And finally, you add 2 points if the fight should take longer or be more dangerous. If you're interested in seeing what a properly balanced battle looks like in practice, check out episode 8 of Bitten. There is a battle with some bandit type adversaries that went very well and was a great challenge for the PCs. Once you know your battle point budget, you'll start picking your adversaries. Here is a list of all of the adversary types and how many points they're worth. A number of minions equal to the size of the party would be 1 point. Socials and supports are also worth 1 point. Hordes, ranged, skulks, or standards are 2. Leaders are 3. Bruisers are 4. And solos are 5. One last thing that I'll say is you can always increase or decrease the tier of an enemy by changing their damage, difficulty, HP, stress, attack modifier, and the number of features they have. Adjust the number to be similar to the other adversaries in that tier, and add or take away a feature or 2 depending on the tier that they were versus a tier that you're using them for. More information on adversary tier adjustments can be found on page 208. All right, once you have your adversaries figured out and your battle points balanced, the next thing to do is to figure out a dynamic environment that the battle will take place in. In Daggerheart, the environments have their very own stat blocks. Examples of these stat blocks can be found on pages 243 to 251. If none of those environments are what you need, you can also head over to page 242 for a similar table to Improvising Adversaries. This table tells you the general stats of an environment and which tier it is. But with that, let's take a look at what these stat blocks look like. First, you'll have the name of the environment, in this case, Raging River. Then you'll see the tier and the type of environment. So tier 1 traversal. There are far less types of environments than there are adversary types. There is only exploration, which are wondrous locations with mysteries and marvels to discover, socials that primarily present interpersonal challenges, traversals that are dangerous locations where moving around the space itself is a challenge, and events, which are defined more by the activity taking place than the space that they're taking place in. After the type, there is a brief description of the environment and then the environment's impulses, which are similar to the adversary's motives and tactics. Then we see the difficulty and the potential adversaries to be found in this area. And then finally, we'll see the environment's features, which also have interesting storytelling questions to add when the features are finally triggered. So at first, I didn't quite understand the point of environments outside of an environment making a tree fall or something like that, but as I was prepping for Bitten, I then realized that environments incorporate your traps and the start of combat encounters that you prepare. For example, in episode 8 of Bitten, there is a trap that I wrote about a storage room exploding. I would spend a fear to have the distilled alcohol barrels in that room explode in a fiery blast. Any PC within the room or within very close range to the door had to make an agility reaction roll, and on a failure, they took 2d20 plus 5 physical damage, and then they were pushed back to close distance away from the door. And then on a success, they would only take half damage and they weren't pushed back. In that same episode, directly after the explosion was triggered, I activated the combat by spending a fear to summon however many adversaries I had in that encounter within close range of that room. So as all of them rushed out of the trapdoor, I was then able to spend a fear to activate each of the adversaries to attack the PCs as an ambush. If I didn't use the environment to start that ambush, I would have had to use a fear for each of the adversaries just to move them into range of the PCs, and since I had just spotlighted all of them to move, I would have been forced to give the spotlight back to the players, and then, once the spotlight came back to me, I would have had barely any fear left to attack. So, use your environments for traps and summoning creatures to start combat encounters. You can also have very specific features on your environments for effects that are unique to that environment, like beginning or ending of a ritual or alterations of how magic works within that location. But I suggest looking through the environments that are in the book to understand the variety of actions, reactions, and passive abilities that have already been written up. And then you may be able to have them in like a separate window while you're prepping your session so that you can take some of those actions, reactions, and passives and then add them to the environments that you're using. Some other general tips for creating combat encounters: make the battle dynamic through interesting alternative goals, unique mechanics, or obstacles like portals, NPCs in trouble, or in episode 5 of Bitten, I had a blighter horde attack the party at a cliffside where they needed to activate a sabotaged magical bridge to escape them. Half of the party was trying to figure out how to get the bridge working, while the other half was trying to fight off the horde of blighters, which created this incredible back and forth tense situation of whether the PCs would be able to safely cross before the blighters got them. Phased battles are also a very interesting way to make an encounter dynamic for a longer, more important battle. Change the battlefield through environmental effects like a blizzard, a dense fog, or breaking up of floating islands in space. Or a battle can quickly change from a fight to a chase scene. Or you can have the BBEG mutate or change halfway through the battle and then give them more deadly features that change how they fight the PCs and in turn how the PCs fight them. You can even use countdowns to incorporate them into these phases, or a looping countdown that randomly changes the environment, as well as the adversary's abilities depending on which environment you roll. Anyway, after all of that planning, we can't forget the most important part, the loot. Gold is based off of handfuls, bags, and chests. 10 handfuls equal a bag, 10 bags equal a chest, and then there's an optional rule for using coins where 10 coins equal 1 handful. In Daggerheart, there aren't any set prices for individual things, which honestly, I wish they had done, but that's neither here nor there. However, they do have a list of average costs of things, including equipment, which you can then use to base your prices off of. I'm not going to go over all of these, so you can just pause to read or find this table on page 165. Outside of buying things, you might also want to give the PCs a few things after a big battle. They have a table for items from pages 129 to 131, and then consumables on 132 and 133. There really isn't any guidelines for how many items to give your players from battles, but if you're rolling for items on the chart, I recommend doing these rolls beforehand. That way, if the item doesn't make sense for the party, or if it's too overpowered, just pick an item that's near the one that you rolled. If your party has equipment from a tier below, try to give them tier appropriate gear as a prize for hard-won battles. Perhaps 1 tier appropriate equipment item per leader and bruiser, and maybe 2 items per solo adversary. This is something that will highly depend on the story you want to tell, so maybe start off by giving consumables and then see how that works out and just go from there. All right, with all of the writing and such finished up, you should have all of the session planned, and now it is time to make a map. I personally use Incarnate. They have a bunch of assets and a pretty easy to use map maker tool. There is a slight learning curve, but once you do get it and start learning the shortcuts, it becomes very easy to use and you can make some really cool maps. Plus, it's only $5 a month or $25 for the year, and that price hasn't changed in the years that I've had it. But there is also Dungeon Draft, which is a relatively cheap one-time purchase of $20. It makes very simple maps, but is a great tool to have because maybe that's all you need. Or maybe you're a Theater of the Mind girly, which is totally valid. I'm a Theater of the Mind girly when I am too lazy to make a map. So anyway, outside of making a map, you will absolutely need to find some music. I have been at this for a long time, y'all. I love music, and I think music elevates the game substantially, so I have tried everything from hours-long YouTube videos of Skyrim music to Spotify playlists based on moods and monsters, but the best thing that I've had by far is Syrinscape. Syrinscape is filled with a ton of different sounds like blazing fires, footsteps walking above you, a variety of music, and they also have a bunch of preset stuff for D&D and Pathfinder campaigns that you could easily just take and use for your Daggerheart game. And if you play online, all you would have to do is send each of your players a link, and then they can open up a window and the music plays through that. I ran a Curse of Strahd actual play called Ravenloft Misfits and used Syrinscape from beginning to end, and the custom Barovia music and sounds that they had were incredible. So to get access to everything, it's only $11 a month, and with that you're able to even upload your own music to play, and you can create your own custom sound sets. I once uploaded a Linkin Park song and it hit so hard for combat. So if you're interested in doing something like that, I'll have a link to all of that in the description. But once you have your music, maps, and session prepped, it is time to finally run the game. But that will be for the next video, where I talk about running a campaign, GM mechanics, and some pitfalls to avoid as a GM. Before then, thank you so much for being here. Leave me a comment if there are any questions or things that you'd like me to cover. I really appreciate y'all being here, and I will see you all in the next video.